The gunshot from Nate Jenkins' rifle echoed across the vast Wyoming landscape, taking down a coyote that had been stalking his cattle. At 53, with silver streaking his once coal-black hair and deep lines etched into his sun-weathered face, Nate reckoned he'd spent enough years on this earth to know what he wanted and what he didn't. Love, with all its complications and heartaches, fell firmly into the latter category. The year was 1887, and Nate had built the Double J Ranch from nothing but sweat and determination. After losing his wife, Margaret, to fever 15 years ago, he'd thrown himself into his work, raising their son alone and expanding their modest homestead into one of the most prosperous cattle operations in Johnson County. Now his boy was grown and married, living in Cheyenne with a family of his own, leaving Nate to the solitude he claimed to prefer. He lowered his Winchester and squinted at the horizon, where the setting sun painted the endless prairie in hues of amber and gold. Another day done. Another night to face alone in his too-quiet ranch house. Getting mighty tired of talking to myself, he muttered to his horse, an aging palomino named Buck who'd been his faithful companion for nearly a decade. The horse nickered softly, as if in agreement. "Don't you start," Nate chided, patting Buck's neck. "Being alone suits me just fine." But as he turned Buck toward home, even he couldn't convince himself it was entirely true. The following morning brought news that would upend Nate's carefully constructed isolation. His foreman, Charlie Fletcher, rode in with information about a new schoolteacher arriving on the afternoon stage. "Town council wants you to help get her settled, boss," Charlie said, accepting the cup of coffee Nate handed him. They stood on the porch of the main house, looking out over the corrals where cowboys were breaking a new string of horses. Nate frowned. "Why me? I don't recall volunteering for welcoming committee duties." "Mayor Simmons specifically asked for you. Said something about you having that big empty house and all. Plus, the schoolhouse roof still needs fixing before she can move into the attached quarters. So, they expect me to house some spinster schoolmarm?" Nate shook his head firmly. "No, sir. Town's got a perfectly good hotel." Charlie smiled slyly. "Hotel's full up with those cattle buyers from Chicago. Besides, the ladies from Boston. Probably never seen a real Wyoming cowboy before." Nate scoffed. "All the more reason to keep her away from me. Last thing I need is some citified woman running scared at the first sign of ranch work." He drained his coffee. "Tell Simmons to find someone else." "He said you'd say that." Charlie reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "Ask me to give you this if you refuse." Nate took the note reluctantly, recognizing the mayor's handwriting. As he read, his scowl deepened. The note reminded him rather pointedly of the town council's unanimous approval of his water rights petition last spring, a decision that had saved the Double J during the drought. It concluded with a not-so-subtle request for Nate to return the favor by hosting the new teacher temporarily. "Damn politicians," Nate muttered, crumpling the paper.
"Fine.
But 2 weeks at the most, then she's someone else's problem." Charlie grinned. "Stage arrives at 4. I'll tell the mayor you agreed." As his foreman rode away, Nate gazed across his land. He'd built his life around predictability and order since Margaret died. Now some stranger would disrupt his routine, his peace. He sighed heavily and turned toward the house. If he was going to have company, the spare room needed airing out. The afternoon stage arrived in a cloud of dust, pulling to a stop outside the Wyoming Pride Hotel in the small town of Cottonwood Creek. Nate stood back from the small crowd that had gathered, arms crossed over his broad chest, his expression guarded beneath the wide brim of his Stetson. Mayor Simmons spotted him and waved him over enthusiastically. "Jenkins, come meet our new educator." Nate reluctantly approached as the stage door opened. He expected a gray-haired woman with spectacles and a stern expression. What emerged instead knocked the wind from his lungs more effectively than any bronco ever had. She couldn't have been more than 30, with rich auburn hair pinned beneath a modest traveling hat. Her traveling suit, though dusty from the journey, was well-tailored and spoke of Eastern refinement. But it was her eyes that caught him, intelligent, determined eyes the color of summer sage that assessed everything around her with keen interest rather than trepidation. "Miss Tabitha Aldridge, allow me to introduce Mr. Nathaniel Jenkins," Mayor Simmons announced proudly. "One of our most established ranchers. He's kindly offered to host you until the schoolhouse accommodations are ready." Those remarkable eyes turned to Nate, and her lips, full and naturally pink, curved into a polite smile. She extended a gloved hand. "Mr. Jenkins, your hospitality is most appreciated. I hope my presence won't be an imposition." Nate found his voice, gruff though it sounded to his own ears. "No imposition, madam." He took her hand briefly, noting its delicacy despite the firmness of her grip. "My ranch is about 3 miles out of town. I'll have your trunks loaded in my wagon." "Thank you." She turned to collect a small valise from the stage driver, moving with a grace that belied her journey's evident fatigue. Mayor Simmons leaned close to Nate. "Isn't she something? Harvard-educated. Turned down positions at prestigious Eastern academies to come west. Said she wanted to make a real difference." Nate grunted noncommittally, though his curiosity was piqued. What would drive such a clearly refined woman to a rough-and-tumble Wyoming cattle town? The ride to the Double J passed mostly in silence. Nate was not one for idle chatter, and Miss Aldridge seemed content to observe the landscape, occasionally asking informed questions about ranching that surprised him with their insight. "My uncle owned a modest farm in Vermont," she explained when he remarked on her knowledge. "I spent summers there as a child. Nothing like this scale, of course." She gestured to the vast expanse of his property as they approached the main house. "Your operation is quite impressive, Mr. Jenkins." Pride flickered in his chest despite himself. "Built it from nearly nothing," he admitted. "Took 25 years. She studied him with those perceptive eyes. "That speaks to remarkable dedication." The wagon rolled to a stop before his 2-story ranch house. It wasn't fancy by Eastern standards, but it was solid and well-built, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. "It's lovely," she said, and sounded sincere. Nate helped her down from the wagon, her gloved hand light on his calloused palm. "Mrs. Gonzalez comes in 3 times a week to cook and clean. She's made up the guest room and left supper for us. I'll have the boys bring in your trunks." Over supper, a hearty beef stew with fresh baked bread, Nate found himself talking more than he had in years. Miss Aldridge asked thoughtful questions about the history of Cottonwood Creek, the challenges of ranching, and the needs of the community's children. 28 students enrolled so far, she said, consulting a small notebook. Ages 6 to 17. Quite a range to accommodate in one classroom. Most of the older boys only attend in winter, Nate explained. They're needed for ranch work the rest of the year. She nodded. "I understand the practical considerations, but education must remain a priority even in farming communities. Perhaps we could institute evening classes for those who work during the day." Her enthusiasm was admirable, if perhaps naive. "Mighty ambitious plan for someone who's just arrived," Nate observed. "I believe in beginning as I mean to go on, Mr. Jenkins." Her chin lifted slightly. "I didn't come west to do things halfway." Something in her determination reminded him of himself as a younger man, and a reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "Well, Miss Aldridge, I reckon Cottonwood Creek won't know what hit it." Her answering smile was warm enough to chase away shadows he'd been living with so long he'd forgotten they were there. Over the following days, Nate found himself increasingly conscious of his guest's presence in his home. The house seemed suddenly brighter, filled with the subtle floral scent of her perfume and the soft rustle of her skirts. Each morning, he'd find her already at the breakfast table, reading or writing letters, her hair neatly arranged for the day. In the evenings, she'd often be on the porch, a book in her lap, watching the sunset with an appreciation that made him see his familiar land through new eyes. They established an unexpected routine. Nate would drive her to town each morning before seeing to his ranch business, then collect her in the late afternoon. Their conversations during these journeys gradually deepened, revealing a woman of remarkable intellect and conviction. "Why here?" he asked her on the fourth day, the question that had been nagging at him since her arrival. "A woman with your education could teach anywhere." Tabitha was quiet for a moment. "After the war, my father established a school for freed slaves in South Carolina. It wasn't popular with many locals." Her voice took on an edge of old pain. "One night, men in masks burned it to the ground. A child died in that fire." Nate's hands tightened on the reins. "I'm sorry." Father never recovered from the guilt. He believed education was the greatest equalizer, that knowledge could overcome hatred and ignorance. Her gaze was fixed on the distant mountains. "When he passed last year, I decided to honor his memory by bringing education to places that need it most." "And you chose Wyoming?" A small smile touched her lips. The advertisement mentioned hardy souls with pioneering spirits required. It seemed fitting. Nate found himself watching her more carefully after that conversation, noticing the determination in her stride as she tackled the disorganized schoolhouse, the patience with which she spoke to the town's children, the careful attention she paid to everyone regardless of station. He began to see what had drawn her west, not naivety, but courage. A week into her stay, Tabitha returned from town with surprising news. "The schoolhouse won't be habitable for at least another month," she announced over dinner. "The damage to the roof was more extensive than they realized, and there's a problem with the chimney as well." Nate frowned. "The mayor promised 2 weeks." "The mayor, I'm discovering, is an optimist when it comes to construction timelines." She hesitated. "If my extended presence is inconvenient, I could inquire at the hotel." "No." The word came out more forcefully than he'd intended. "That is, there's no need. This house has stood mostly empty for too long." The smile she gave him warmed something inside that had been cold for years. That weekend, instead of driving her to town, Nate suggested showing Tabitha more of his property. To his surprise, she asked to ride rather than take the wagon. "I've been riding since childhood," she explained when he raised an eyebrow. "Though I admit side saddle is not my preference." Nate chuckled. "Out here, practicality often trumps propriety, Miss Aldridge. I've got an old split skirt my daughter-in-law left behind that might suit." And so they set out on horseback under a brilliant blue Wyoming sky, Tabitha looking perfectly at ease astride a gentle mare, her hair braided down her back and a borrowed hat shading her face. Nate found himself pointing out features of his land with pride: the creek that never ran dry, even in drought years, the sheltered valley where his cattle wintered, the aspen grove he'd planted for his late wife, who'd missed the trees of her Virginia home. "She must have been remarkable," Tabitha said softly when he mentioned Margaret. "She was." Nate's throat tightened with familiar grief, though the sharp edge had dulled over the years. "Too good for the harsh life out here, but she never complained." "And you've been alone since?" He nodded. "Raised our boy alone after she passed. Never saw the sense in trying to replace her." "Some would argue that loving again doesn't mean replacement," Tabitha observed, her eyes on the distant horizon. "Just continuing the journey with a new companion." Nate didn't respond, but her words stayed with him as they rode on. They stopped to rest by a scenic overlook where the land fell away to reveal miles of rolling prairie. As they shared the lunch Mrs. Gonzalez had packed, Tabitha asked about his son. "Noah's 30 now, with 2 little ones of his own." Pride colored Nate's voice. "Wanted to make his own way, not just inherit what I built. I can't fault him for that." "You must miss them." "Every day." The admission came easier than he expected. "But a man gets used to solitude." Tabitha studied him thoughtfully. "Does he? Or does he simply convince himself there's no alternative?" Before Nate could answer, the sky darkened abruptly. A summer storm was rolling in faster than he'd anticipated. "We need to find shelter," he said, quickly packing their things. "There's a lined shack about half a mile from here." They barely reached the small cabin before the heavens opened. Rain pounded the roof as they rushed inside, both soaked despite their haste. The lined shack was simple, but sound: a single room with a small stove, a rough table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot. "Not exactly the Plaza Hotel," Nate said wryly as he lit the lantern hanging from a ceiling beam. Tabitha laughed, wringing water from her braid. "I've stayed in worse places. At least this one doesn't appear to have mice." "Can't promise that," he warned, crouching to light a fire in the stove. He gestured to a trunk in the corner. "There should be some dry blankets in there. Best get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." A moment of awkwardness descended as they both registered the intimacy of their situation. Nate cleared his throat. "I'll wait outside on the porch while you change." "In the pouring rain? Don't be absurd." Tabitha's practical nature asserted itself. "Turn her back, and I'll do the same for you afterward." Nate did as she suggested, listening to the soft rustle of fabric as she changed. The small cabin suddenly felt even smaller, the air between them charged with an awareness he hadn't felt in decades. "You can turn around now." She had wrapped herself in a rough wool blanket, her wet clothes draped over a chair near the stove to dry. Her hair, freed from its braid, fell in damp waves past her shoulders. Without the formality of her usual attire, she looked younger, more vulnerable. Nate swallowed hard and took his turn changing while she faced the wall. The storm showed no signs of abating, rain hammering against the roof and windows in sheets. "Looks like we're stuck here for a while," he said once they were both settled, sitting on opposite sides of the small table, sipping coffee he'd brewed on the stove. "These summer storms can be fierce, but usually pass quickly." "I don't mind," Tabitha said, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. "It's rather cozy." Something in her tone made his heart beat faster. A warning voice in his head told him to keep his distance, but it was increasingly difficult to remember why. "Mr. Jenkins, Nate," he corrected. "Seems a bit formal to stand on ceremony when we're sharing a one-room cabin in a thunderstorm." She smiled. "Nate, then. And you should call me Tabitha." "Tabitha." He liked the way her name felt on his lips. She leaned forward slightly. "May I ask you something personal?" He nodded cautiously. "Are you truly content with your solitude? Or is it simply the path of least resistance?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "I'm too old to be starting over with someone new," he said finally. "Too set in my ways." 53 is hardly ancient, she countered, surprising him with her knowledge of his age. "The mayor is quite forthcoming with information," she explained with a small smile. "Old enough," Nate insisted. "You're what, 30? You've got your whole life ahead of you." 32, she corrected. "And I'm old enough to know my own mind, to recognize a kindred spirit when I meet one." The implication of her words hung between them. Nate stood abruptly, moving to the window to watch the rain rather than meet her gaze. "You deserve better than an aging cowboy, Tabitha. Someone who can give you children a future." He heard her rise, felt her presence behind him before she spoke. "I believe I'm capable of determining what I deserve." Her voice was soft but resolute. "And what I want." Nate turned, finding her closer than he expected. The blanket she'd wrapped around herself had loosened slightly, revealing the elegant curve of her neck and collarbone. "This is madness," he said hoarsely. "We've known each other barely 2 weeks. Sometimes 2 weeks is enough to recognize what others might take years to see." She reached up, her fingers feather-light against his cheek. "You're not too old for love, Nate. You're merely afraid of it." Her insight struck too close to home. "And if I am," he challenged, "if I tell you I'm too old, too stubborn, too set in my ways to change now?" Her eyes, full of determination and something deeper that made his breath catch, held his gaze steadily. "Then I'm too stubborn to quit you." The storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest those words unleashed within him. For years, he'd convinced himself that the part of him capable of loving had died with Margaret. Now, with 5 simple words, this remarkable woman had shattered that illusion. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home to a place he'd never been before. Her lips were soft beneath his, yielding yet demanding in equal measure. She wound her arms around his neck, pressing closer as the blanket slipped further, revealing the simple camisole beneath. Nate's arms encircled her waist, holding her as if she might vanish if he loosened his grip. When they finally parted, both breathless, the rain had softened to a gentle patter. "This changes everything," he murmured against her temple. "Good," she replied, her smile evident in her voice. "Some things need changing." The ride back to the ranch was quiet but charged with a new awareness between them. They had done nothing more than share that kiss and talk through the storm, learning each other's histories, dreams, and fears. By the time the sun had broken through the clouds, Nate knew with a certainty that defied logic that Tabitha Aldridge had forever altered his carefully ordered world. As the days turned into weeks, Nate found himself living a life he'd never imagined possible again. Tabitha's promised 2-week stay extended as the schoolhouse repairs dragged on, a delay he now secretly blessed. Each morning brought the joy of seeing her at his breakfast table. Each evening offered the pleasure of sharing the day's events over dinner. On Sundays, they rode together across his land, sometimes picnicking by the creek or exploring the foothills. Nate found himself showing her all his favorite places: the hidden waterfall where he'd proposed to Margaret decades earlier, the ridge where he'd decided to build his ranch, the ancient cottonwood where he often went to think. She accepted these glimpses into his soul with a grace that humbled him. Their courtship was a quiet thing, conducted largely away from the prying eyes of Cottonwood Creek, though Nate had no illusions that their growing attachment had gone unnoticed. He saw the knowing looks from his ranch hands, caught the speculative glances when he escorted Tabitha to church each Sunday, her hand resting in the crook of his arm. "People are talking," he mentioned one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "People always talk," Tabitha replied serenely, her hand finding his on the armrest between their chairs. "Does it bother you?" He considered the question honestly. Once perhaps it might have. Now he found he cared little for others' opinions. "No. But I worry about your reputation as the schoolteacher." She laughed softly. "Fortunately, the school board is more concerned with my teaching abilities than my personal life. And the children adore you when you come to help with their writing lessons." It was true. Nate had found himself volunteering at the school once it finally opened, teaching the older boys about horses and cattle management. The hours he spent there, watching Tabitha in her element, firm but kind, demanding excellence while offering encouragement, only deepened his admiration for her. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of gold to the aspen leaves, Nate faced a truth he could no longer deny. He was deeply, irrevocably in love with Tabitha Aldridge. The realization terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. It was during the Harvest Festival in late September that matters came to a head. The entire community gathered in town for dancing, food, and celebration of another successful growing season. Nate, never much for social gatherings, found himself enjoying the evening with Tabitha on his arm, her emerald dress bringing out the color of her eyes. "May I have this dance, Miss Aldridge?" he asked formally as the band struck up a waltz. She curtsied playfully. "Why, Mr. Jenkins, I thought you didn't dance." "For you, I'm willing to make an exception." He led her onto the floor, surprising her with his competence. "Margaret insisted I learn. Said no husband of hers would be a wallflower." She was a wise woman. Tabitha followed his lead perfectly, their movements in harmony. As they danced, Nate was acutely aware of the eyes upon them, the whispers behind fans and raised eyebrows. One voice in particular carried clearly George Peterson, a wealthy merchant new to town. Rather inappropriate, wouldn't you say? Peterson remarked to his companion loudly enough to be overheard. A man his age courting a woman young enough to be his daughter. She's clearly after his property. Nate stiffened, his hand tightening on Tabitha's waist. She squeezed his shoulder gently. "Ignore him," she murmured. "His opinion means nothing." But the barb had struck home, reviving doubts Nate had been trying to quell for weeks. Was he being selfish, tying a vibrant young woman to an aging rancher? What future could he truly offer her? The question haunted him through the remainder of the evening and followed him home, driving a wedge of uncertainty between them. That night, as they sat before the fire in his study, Nate finally gave voice to his fears. "Peterson wasn't entirely wrong," he said heavily. "The age difference between us is significant. You deserve someone who can grow old with you, not someone who's already halfway there." Tabitha set down her book, her expression serious. "Are we having this conversation again? I thought we'd moved past these doubts." "It's not just about age," he persisted. "It's about what's fair to you. I've had my chance at love, at building a life. You're just beginning." "That's not for you to decide," she replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. "I know my own heart and mind. I choose you, Nathaniel Jenkins, with all that entails. Even if it means giving up having children of your own?" He challenged. "I'm too old to start raising babies again." A flash of hurt crossed her face. "Have you asked me if that's what I want? If children are my priority?" Nate hesitated, realizing he hadn't. "For your information," she continued, rising from her chair, "I made peace long ago with the likelihood that I might never have children. My doctor in Boston informed me after a serious illness in my 20s that conception would be difficult, if not impossible." Her voice trembled slightly. "But I don't recall you proposing marriage for us to be discussing such matters anyway." The pain in her eyes cut him deeply. He stood, reaching for her, but she stepped back. "Tabitha, I didn't know." "No, you didn't," she interrupted. "Because you've been so busy convincing yourself of all the reasons we shouldn't be together that you never bothered to ask what I truly want." Her chin lifted in that determined way he'd come to love. "I want a partner who respects my choices, Nate. Who trusts that when I say I love him, I mean it without reservation or calculation." "I do trust you," he insisted. "It's myself I doubt." "Then that's your burden to resolve." She moved toward the door. "I'll be returning to town tomorrow. The schoolhouse quarters are finally habitable, and it's time I established myself there properly." Panic gripped him. "Tabitha, please. When you decide whether you're truly too old for love or simply too afraid of it, you know where to find me." With that, she left the room, her footsteps fading down the hallway. Nate stood rooted to the spot, feeling as though something precious was slipping through his fingers. Pride and fear warred within him, pride that insisted he let her go for her own good, fear that whispered he might never find such happiness again. He slept little that night, and by morning, Tabitha had already arranged for one of the ranch hands to take her and her belongings to town. Their parting was civil but strained, with too many words left unspoken between them. The following weeks were among the most miserable of Nate's life. The house, once brightened by Tabitha's presence, seemed emptier than ever. He threw himself into ranch work, exhausting his body in hopes of quieting his mind, but thoughts of her persisted. He saw her occasionally in town, always polite, always professional, always with that hint of sadness in her eyes that matched the ache in his own chest. Pride kept him from approaching her, from admitting he'd been a fool. Instead, he watched from a distance as she built her life in Cottonwood Creek without him, earning the respect of parents and the adoration of her students. It was Charlie, his long-suffering foreman, who finally broke through his stubborn isolation. Boss, permission to speak freely? He asked one evening as they finished checking the herd. When have you ever needed permission? Nate retorted. Fair enough. Charlie adjusted his hat. You're making yourself and everyone around you miserable. Either ride into town and make things right with Miss Aldridge, or stop moping around the ranch like someone shot your dog. Nate glared at him. I don't recall asking for your advice on my personal affairs. No, but you need it all the same. Charlie's weathered face softened. I lost my Sarah to consumption 30 years ago. If I had the chance you've got to find love again with a good woman, I'd grab it with both hands and never let go. The simple wisdom of his friend's words struck Nate with unexpected force. What was he really afraid of? Not the years between them, nor the opinions of others. What terrified him was the possibility of loving so deeply again and losing everything, of surviving that pain twice in one lifetime. But wasn't that the very nature of love? The risk of loss balanced against the joy of connection? And hadn't Tabitha shown her own courage in offering her heart to him despite his stubborn resistance? As if reading his thoughts, Charlie added quietly, loving again doesn't dishonor Margaret's memory, boss. She wouldn't have wanted you living half a life, all these years. That night, Nate sat at his desk and penned a letter to his son Noah, pouring out his heart about Tabitha, his fears, and his hopes. Noah's reply arrived by telegraph a week later. Father, life too short for regrets. If you love her, fight for her. We would welcome her to our family with open arms. The simple blessing from his son was the final push Nate needed. The following Sunday, he dressed in his best suit, polished his boots until they gleamed, and rode into Cottonwood Creek with a purpose. He found Tabitha at the small church, helping to arrange flowers for the service. She looked up as he entered, surprise flickering across her face before her expression composed into careful politeness. Mr. Jenkins, this is unexpected. Tabitha. He removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. Might I have a moment of your time? In private. She hesitated, then nodded, leading him to the church's small garden. They stood beneath an ancient cottonwood, its leaves rustling softly in the autumn breeze. You're looking well, he said awkwardly. Thank you. Her response was reserved, guarded. Is there something specific you wish to discuss? Nate took a deep breath. I've been a fool. The words tumbled out gracelessly, but honestly. A stubborn, prideful old fool who is so afraid of being hurt again that I pushed away the best thing that's happened to me in 15 years. Her eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, waiting. I told myself I was protecting you, but the truth is, I was protecting myself. He stepped closer. You were right, I'm not too old for love. I'm just out of practice at being brave enough to reach for it. Nate, please let me finish. He took her hands in his, relief flooding through him when she didn't pull away. I love you, Tabitha Aldridge. I love your determination and your intelligence, your kindness and your stubbornness. I love the way you see the best in people, the way you've brought light back into my life when I thought that part of me was gone forever. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she remained silent. I don't care what people say about our ages or our differences. All I know is that I want to spend whatever years I have left with you by my side, if you'll still have me. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. I should have done this properly weeks ago, but I'm doing it now. He opened the box to reveal a ring not ostentatious, but elegant in its simplicity, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds in an antique gold setting. This was my grandmother's, he explained, his voice rough with emotion. She gave it to me before she died, said to save it for when I found love again. I never believed I would, until you. Tabitha's composure finally broke, tears spilling down her cheeks. You're quite sure you're not too old for this? She asked, a hint of her usual spirit returning. I'm sure that I'm too old to waste another day without you, he answered honestly. Tabitha Aldridge, Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Her answer came not in words but in action as she stepped forward, framing his face with her hands, and kissed him with such feeling that no doubt could remain of her answer. When they finally parted, she was smiling through her tears. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Nathaniel Jenkins." He slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, then pulled her close, his heart lighter than it had been in years. They were married 2 weeks later in the same church where he'd proposed, with the entire community in attendance. Noah and his family traveled from Cheyenne for the ceremony, his 2 young children serving as ring bearer and flower girl. Even George Peterson offered grudging congratulations at the reception, clearly surprised by the genuine happiness evident between the newlyweds. As winter settled over Cottonwood Creek, Nate and Tabitha established a new rhythm to their shared life. She continued teaching, her passion for education undiminished by marriage. Nate expanded his involvement with the school, establishing a scholarship fund for promising students who wished to continue their education beyond what the small town could offer. Their home, once a monument to Nate's solitude, became a gathering place for the community. Tabitha hosted literary discussions for the town's women, while Nate mentored young men interested in ranching. Together, they built a life richer than either had imagined possible. On their first anniversary, as they sat before the fire in the study where they'd once nearly lost each other to pride and fear, Tabitha presented Nate with a leather-bound journal. "What's this?" he asked, turning the beautiful book in his hands. "Open it," she urged. Inside, in her elegant handwriting, was the beginning of their story, how a stubborn cowboy had claimed he was too old for love, and how an equally stubborn schoolteacher had refused to accept his resignation from life. "I thought we might continue it together," she explained, nestling against his side. "For those who come after us, so they'll know that love doesn't recognize the boundaries of age or circumstance." Nate wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You are the wisest, most stubborn woman I've ever known," he murmured against her hair. "Thank God you refused to quit me." "I told you I was too stubborn," she reminded him with a smile. "And I've never been happier to lose an argument in my life." Outside, snow began to fall, covering the land in pristine white, while inside, the warmth of their love kept the chill at bay. As Nate held his wife in the firelight, he reflected on the miraculous turns life could take when one found the courage to open one's heart again. He had once believed his capacity for love died with Margaret. Now he understood that the heart could expand to embrace new love without diminishing the old. In Tabitha's stubborn refusal to accept his limitations, he had found not just a second chance at love, but a new purpose, a new vision for his remaining years. Together, they would build a legacy of love and learning that would outlast them both in the community they now served side by side. "I love you," he whispered. "And I you," she answered, her eyes reflecting the firelight and the promise of all their tomorrows. Always and stubbornly.